Story disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction and is intended for entertainment purposes only. The content includes dark themes, horror elements, and fictional depictions of rituals and sacrifices that are purely imaginative and not reflective of any real-life practices or beliefs. Viewer discretion is advised. This video is not suitable for younger audiences, and parental guidance is recommended. The story does not endorse or promote any harmful behavior, violence, or dangerous activities. Please note that all characters, events, and settings are entirely fictional and created for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. In the heart of a bustling African city, a young boy named Eo is marked by the ancient gods, his fate intertwined with powers beyond human understanding. When a mysterious woman with a dark veil appears, Eo's life is thrown into chaos. Secrets buried in the city's forgotten corners begin to surface, revealing a world of dark magic, forgotten rituals, and gods who once ruled over the land. But with power comes danger, ancient forces are stirring, and the city itself may be on the brink of destruction. As Eo and his friends navigate the twisting maze of their own destinies, they must confront the terrifying truths about the gods' return. But can they stop the gods from reclaiming their lost kingdom? Or will they become pawns in a game far bigger than themselves? Join us for an unforgettable journey into a world where magic and myth collide, and the price of survival is higher than ever. Don't miss out on the dark twists and shocking secrets waiting in every episode. In the heart of Ngola, a vibrant African city where the new and old blended seamlessly, Eo worked at his family's market stall. The bustling crowds, colorful fabrics, and rhythmic music made every day feel alive. Yet, lately, something had changed in the air. It felt heavier, more charged, as if the city was holding its breath. It all began one afternoon when a strange old woman appeared at their stall. She wore a simple brown cloak, but her eyes seemed to hold ancient secrets. As Eo handed her a basket of fruits, she grasped his hand firmly, her fingers cold as stone. A sharp jolt of energy surged through him. "You are marked," she whispered in a language Eo barely understood. Her voice was rough, like wind blowing through dry leaves. "They will come for you soon." Eo's heart pounded. "Who will come?" "The forgotten gods," the old woman said, leaning closer. "They never truly left, but they have been waiting for someone like you." Before Eo could react, the woman vanished into the crowd, leaving behind only the lingering coldness of her touch. His hands trembled as he stood frozen in place. What did she mean by marked? And why had she spoken to him? Eo tried to shake off the encounter, but all afternoon, he felt strange. His surroundings seemed off, as though shadows moved on their own, whispering secrets he couldn't understand. That night, sleep didn't come easily. His dreams were filled with unsettling images, ancient temples, dark forests, and a faint but ever-present chant that echoed in his mind. In the distance, he saw a figure standing on a hill, watching him. Eo woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing. Something was happening, something he could not yet explain. Eo spent the next few days trying to forget the old woman's words, but the feeling of unease stayed with him. He didn't mention the encounter to anyone, not even his family. But as time passed, strange things began to happen. It started with the animals in the market. Birds that once happily chirped near the stalls now stayed away when Eo was near. Stray dogs barked at him without reason, and he noticed their fearful eyes tracking him as he walked past. Then came the dreams, every night, the same dream of the dark figure standing on the hill. Each time, the figure grew closer. One morning, as Eo washed his face, he saw something different in the mirror. A small, dark symbol had appeared on the back of his left hand. It wasn't a cut or bruise, it was something else, something ancient. The mark was shaped like a spiral, surrounded by symbols he didn't recognize. Eo's chest tightened. He scrubbed at the mark with soap and water, but it wouldn't fade. Panicked, he wrapped a cloth around his hand and went about his day, trying to ignore the throbbing sensation that had begun in his palm. The whispers returned that afternoon. As Eo walked through the market, the sounds of the crowd seemed to fade, replaced by low murmurs that only he could hear. They grew louder with every step, like invisible voices whispering directly into his ears. Eo. He spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Sweat dripped down his neck as the whispers continued, growing more insistent. Eo, they are watching. The shadows seemed to stretch out, pulling towards him as if alive. He felt their presence, cold and hungry. Eo turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Whatever was happening, he knew one thing: the woman's warning had not been a coincidence. Something was after him. Determined to understand what was happening to him, Eo sought out the oldest man in the city, Baba Tand, a well-respected elder known for his knowledge of Ngola's forgotten history. Baba Tand's house sat on the edge of the city, far from the noise of the streets, surrounded by thick baobab trees that were said to be older than the city itself. Eo knocked on the wooden door, his heart pounding. After a moment, Baba Tand opened it. He was small and frail, with skin as wrinkled as old leather, but his eyes were sharp and bright. "Come in, boy," Baba Tand said, his voice strong despite his age. "I've been expecting you." Eo hesitated, then stepped inside. How could Baba Tand have known he was coming? They sat together in the dimly lit room, and Eo told him everything: the strange woman, the mark on his hand, and the whispers that had been following him. Baba Tand listened silently, his face unreadable. When Eo finished, the old man sighed deeply. "The forgotten gods," he said softly. "They were once worshipped in this land, long before the new gods arrived. They ruled the skies, the earth, and the underworld. But as people stopped believing, they faded into the shadows." Baba Tand leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "But they never left. They are always waiting for someone with the mark." Eo's blood ran cold. "What does that mean for me?" "It means they have chosen you," Baba Tand said. "You are connected to them now. They will use you to return to this world." Eo stood abruptly, his chest tightening with fear. "I don't want this. I didn't ask for this." Baba Tand shook his head sadly. "It doesn't matter what you want, boy. The gods have chosen, and they do not ask for permission." The sun was setting over Ngola, casting long shadows over the city as Eo made his way back home. Baba Tand's words weighed heavily on his mind. Chosen by the gods. What did that even mean? And why him? As Eo approached his house, he felt it again, the cold presence. The whispers had returned, faint but unmistakable. He hurried inside, locking the door behind him, but the feeling only grew stronger. Suddenly, the room seemed darker, as if the shadows were closing in around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he felt a sharp pain in his hand. The mark was burning. Eo stumbled backward, his breath coming in gasps. The air grew thick with energy, and then he saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, cloaked in darkness. They circled him, their faces hidden, their eyes glowing faintly with a sinister light. Without warning, they began to chant in a language Eo couldn't understand, their voices low and menacing. The mark on his hand burned hotter, and he cried out in pain, clutching it tightly. The figures raised their arms, then the room grew colder. Eo could feel the energy building, swirling around him like a storm. His mind raced. What was happening? Were they performing some kind of ritual? One of the figures stepped forward, holding a small animal, the bird, its wings trembling. In a swift motion, the figure brought the bird to the mark on Eo's hand. The bird's feathers turned black as they touched his skin, and a faint glow surrounded it. Eo felt the power flowing into him, dark and terrible. The chant grew louder, the shadows twisting and writhing around them. The bird gave a final cry before falling silent, its body vanishing into the darkness. Eo gasped, his head spinning. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures were gone. The room was silent, but the energy still pulsed in the air. The mark on Eo's hand continued to glow faintly, but the pain had subsided. His breath was shaky, his heart still racing from the intensity of the ritual he had just witnessed. The mark on his hand no longer looked like just a simple spiral, it now seemed to pulse with its own life, as if it had absorbed the energy from the ritual. He collapsed onto the floor, struggling to understand what had just happened. What kind of power had the forgotten gods just given him? And why did it feel both terrifying and strangely familiar? The old woman's words echoed in his mind, they never truly left, but they have been waiting. Eo could no longer deny it. The gods, these ancient, dark gods, were real, and they had chosen him for something far greater than he could comprehend. But why? What did they want from him? The next morning, Eo woke to the sound of pounding on his front door. His mind was foggy from the previous night's events, and for a moment he wasn't sure if it had all been a dream. But the burning sensation in his hand told him otherwise. Eo, are you there? It was his friend Kofi, the one person he had known since childhood. Eo staggered to the door and opened it. Kofi, tall and thin, his dreadlocks falling over his eyes, stood outside, looking concerned. You didn't show up at the market this morning, Kofi said, peering at Eo's pale face. What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. Eo glanced at his hand, then back at Kofi. Should he tell him? Could Kofi even understand what had happened? How could he explain that ancient gods had marked him, that dark forces were now stirring, and he was at the center of it all? I just didn't feel well, Eo stammered. Rough night. Kofi raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Well, you should rest then. But there's something going on in the city you should know about. People are talking about strange things, people going missing, animals acting weird. Eo's heart skipped a beat. Could it be connected to the gods? Were these disappearances related to what was happening to him? They say there's some kind of cult in the city, Kofi continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. People are scared. Something dark is coming, Eo. The word cult sent chills down Eo's spine. He had to find out more about these disappearances, and he had to understand the connection between them and the forgotten gods. But first, he needed answers, real answers. I need to talk to Baba Tand again, Eo muttered, more to himself than to Kofi. Kofi looked confused. The old man? Why? What does he have to do with this? Eo shook his head. It's complicated. But I have to go. I'll meet you at the market later. Kofi gave him a wary look but nodded. Be careful, Eo. This feels dangerous. Eo knew Kofi was right. Whatever was happening in the city was bigger than just the whispers he'd been hearing. Dark forces were awakening, and somehow, he was tied to them. Baba Tan's house felt even more foreboding as Eo approached it, the thick baobab trees casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Eo hesitated at the door, knowing that whatever answers he sought would not come easily, or without consequence. When Baba Tan opened the door, his face was solemn. You felt it, haven't you? He asked, his eyes narrowing. The power within you. The gods have begun their work. Eo stepped inside, his mouth dry. I don't want this power. I don't even know what it is. Baba Tand motioned for him to sit. The forgotten gods chose you because you have something they need. You are a vessel, Eo, a bridge between their world and ours. And now, they are using that bridge to cross over. Eo's stomach tightened with fear. But why me? Why now? The old man sighed, leaning on his walking stick. There is a prophecy. A child of the city, marked by the gods, would come when the world has forgotten them. You are that child, Eo. The gods seek to reclaim their dominion through you. Eo's hands trembled as he looked down at the glowing mark on his skin. It felt like a curse. But I never asked for this. How do I stop them? Babatan's eyes grew dark. You can't stop them, Eo. The God's will is not something you can deny. But there may be a way to control the power they've given you, to channel it, rather than be consumed by it. Eo listened intently, the weight of the prophecy sinking in. He wasn't just marked, he was part of something ancient, something bigger than he had ever imagined. But if he could control the power, maybe he could protect the city, protect the people he cared about. How? Eo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There are rituals, Babatan said gravely. Dark rituals. But they come with great risk. The power you will summon could either save you or destroy you. Determined to take control of his fate, Eo agreed to undergo the ritual that Babatan spoke of. He knew that the risks were great, but the alternative, allowing the gods to use him as a pawn, was far worse. That night, Babatan led Eo deep into the forest outside Ngola, to a place where the ancient gods were once worshipped. The air was thick with the scent of earth and leaves, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, weathered and covered in moss. Babatan began to draw symbols in the dirt around the altar, chanting softly in the old tongue. Eo felt a chill run down his spine as the shadows around them seemed to thicken, as if watching. The ritual will test your spirit, Babatan said, his voice low and steady. You must face the darkness within you. Only then will you gain control over the power that binds you to the gods. Eo swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew there was no turning back now. As Babatan continued his chant, Eo stepped up to the altar and placed his hand on the cold stone surface. Immediately, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, and the world around him went dark. Eo found himself standing in a vast, empty space, no sky, no ground, just an endless void. In the distance, he saw a figure moving toward him, its form shifting and changing. It was him. Or rather, the twisted version of him, darker, more sinister. The figure grinned, and Eo's heart raced as he realized what he was facing, his own fear, his own darkness. The figure lunged at him, its hands outstretched, and Eo braced himself for impact. The battle for control had begun. Eo's pulse quickened as the dark figure charged toward him. It moved like a shadow, twisting and warping, its face a grotesque version of his own, with hollow eyes and a wicked grin. This was no ordinary enemy, it was the embodiment of his darkest fears, everything he had tried to bury inside. Instinctively, Eo raised his hands in defense, but the figure was too fast. It slammed into him, knocking him to the ground with a force that stole the breath from his lungs. He struggled to push it off, but it was like wrestling with smoke, slippery and intangible. You can't escape me, Eo, the figure hissed, its voice a chilling whisper. I am everything you fear. I am the doubt that gnaws at you, the weakness you hide. You'll never be rid of me. Eo's heart pounded in his chest. He had never faced anything like this before. Every time he tried to stand, the figure pushed him down, overpowering him. It was as if his own fears were dragging him into the abyss. But then, in the depths of his mind, Eo remembered something Babatan had told him, you must face the darkness within you. Only then will you gain control. Eo closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. He needed to confront this thing, not fight it. This wasn't a battle of strength, it was a test of his will. Slowly, he rose to his feet, standing firm in front of the shadow. I'm not afraid of you, Eo said, his voice trembling but resolute. You're a part of me, but you don't control me. The figure's grin faltered for a moment, and in that instant, Eo felt a shift. The shadow recoiled, no longer looming as large as before. It was still there, still menacing, but its power was diminishing. Eo could feel it. He took a step forward, his confidence growing. I accept you. I accept my fears, my doubts, and my weaknesses. But you won't define me. The figure shrank, its form flickering and losing shape. Eo could sense its power fading as he embraced his own strength. Finally, with a final burst of determination, he reached out and touched the shadow, and it dissolved into nothingness. The darkness around him lifted, and Eo found himself back in the forest, standing before the stone altar. Baba Tan stood nearby, watching with a knowing look in his eyes. You passed the first trial, Baba Tan said softly. But this is only the beginning. The gods are watching, and they will not make it easy for you. Eo's hand still pulsed with the faint glow of the mark, but he felt different now. Stronger. He had faced his own darkness and survived. But he knew that there were more challenges ahead, and the gods' intentions remained unclear. The days that followed were filled with unease. Eo could feel the power within him growing, but with it came a constant sense of dread. He could sense the presence of the gods more clearly now, whispers in the wind, shadows that seemed to move on their own. They were watching him, waiting for the next step in their plan. One evening, as Eo sat alone in his small apartment, there was a sudden knock at the door. His heart jumped, and he hesitated before opening it. Standing on the other side was a woman he had never seen before. She was tall, with skin the color of rich mahogany and eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Her hair was braided into intricate patterns, and she wore a long robe that shimmered like the night sky. I've been sent by the gods, the woman said in a calm, almost musical voice. My name is Adisa. Eo stepped back, unsure of how to respond. Sent by the gods. Why? Adisa smiled faintly. The gods have plans for you, Eo. They've been watching you closely, and now they wish to speak. Eo's mind raced. He had known the gods were watching him, but he hadn't expected them to send someone directly to him. What do they want? Adisa's eyes softened. They want to guide you. You've been chosen, Eo, to be their messenger in this world. But there are forces working against you, forces that would see the gods remain forgotten and their power extinguished. Eo's stomach tightened. Forces? You mean the cult? Adisa nodded. Yes, the cult seeks to keep the gods buried in the past, to ensure that their influence never rises again. But with your help, the gods can reclaim their place in this world. You must prepare yourself for the coming battle. Eo's thoughts spun. This was all happening too fast. He had only just begun to understand his connection to the gods, and now he was being thrust into a conflict that seemed far beyond his control. What do I have to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Adisa stepped forward, placing a hand on Eo's shoulder. The gods will guide you. But you must trust in them and in yourself. The power within you is only beginning to awaken. In time, you will understand. Eo felt a strange warmth radiating from her touch, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't as powerless as he had thought. But even as Adisa spoke, Eo knew that the path ahead would be dangerous. The cult, the gods, the dark forces stirring in the shadows, he was caught in the middle of something ancient and powerful. And he wasn't sure if he was ready. The following night, Eo received another visitor, but this time, it was not a friendly one. He was walking home from the market when he noticed a group of figures trailing behind him. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but as he quickened his pace, so did they. By the time he reached his street, his heart was pounding in his chest. Just as he was about to reach his apartment, one of the figures stepped in front of him, blocking his path. The man wore a long, dark robe, and his face was partially hidden beneath a hood. "You've been marked by the gods," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "But you do not understand the danger you're in. The gods cannot protect you from what's coming." Eo's pulse quickened. He glanced around, but the street was empty, and the other figures had closed in behind him, cutting off any chance of escape. "What do you want?" Eo asked, his voice trembling. The man chuckled softly. "We are the keepers of the old ways. The gods you serve are relics of a forgotten past. Their time is over, and we will make sure they never rise again." Eo clenched his fists, the mark on his hand tingling with energy. "I don't want any trouble." The man stepped closer, his breath hot against Eo's skin. "It's too late for that. You've already chosen your path. But know this, the gods you serve will betray you. They always do." Before Eo could respond, the man raised his hand, and a sharp pain shot through Eo's head. He stumbled back, his vision blurring, and the last thing he saw was the man's cold smile before everything went black. Eo's eyes fluttered open, his head pounding. He found himself in a dimly lit room with stone walls, cold and damp. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a strange mix of earth and smoke. Chains rattled softly in the distance, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he was still dreaming or if this was some twisted reality. He tried to move, but his arms were bound by thick ropes to a wooden chair. Panic surged through him as he tugged at the restraints, but they held firm. His mind raced, trying to piece together how he had ended up here. The last thing he remembered was the cultist's chilling smile before everything had gone dark. The door creaked open, and Eo tensed. A figure stepped into the room, bathed in shadow. It was the same man who had confronted him in the street, his hood still covering half of his face, but now Eo could see his cold, piercing eyes more clearly. "Welcome, Eo," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. "You have become a problem. The gods may have chosen you, but their influence is fading. And we, the cult of shadows, will ensure they remain forgotten." Eo glared at him, trying to mask his fear. "What do you want with me? I don't even fully understand what's happening." The man chuckled softly, circling Eo like a predator stalking its prey. "Of course you don't. You're just a pawn in their game, a vessel for their power. But they're using you, Eo. The gods don't care about you, they care about reclaiming the world they lost." Eo swallowed hard, refusing to let the man's words shake him. "I don't believe you. The gods chose me for a reason, and I'll fight for them." The man stopped in front of him, leaning in close so that Eo could feel his breath on his face. "You will fight, yes. But you will lose. You see, the gods demand loyalty, but they are as cruel as they are powerful. They feed on fear, on darkness, on sacrifice. And when they are done with you, they will discard you without a second thought." Eo's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let doubt creep in. "I don't trust you," he spat. "You and your cult are the ones who want to keep people in the dark. The gods want to help us remember who we really are." The man smirked. "Is that what they told you?" "Oh, Eo, you are more naive than I thought. But no matter. You will soon learn the truth." With that, the man turned and gestured to someone outside the room. Two more cultists appeared, dragging a large stone basin filled with a thick, dark liquid. They placed it in front of Eo, and the scent of it made his stomach churn. It smelled like death, old and musty, like something that had been buried for centuries. The cult leader turned back to Eo, his eyes gleaming with malice. "This is the blood of the forgotten. It is the essence of the gods who were cast aside, those whose names were lost to time. You will drink it, and through it, you will see the truth." Eo recoiled in horror. "I'm not drinking anything." But the cult leader's smile only widened. "Oh, but you will. You see, Eo, this is not a choice. This is destiny. The two cultists grabbed Eo's head, forcing his mouth open. He struggled, kicking and twisting, but they were too strong. They poured the thick, black liquid into his mouth, and the taste of it burned his throat, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. As the liquid seeped into his body, Eo's vision blurred again, but this time, it wasn't darkness that greeted him. Instead, he found himself standing in a vast, empty void, a place where time seemed to stand still. The sky was an endless black, and the ground beneath him felt like it was made of shadows. And then, out of the darkness, figures began to emerge. They were twisted, distorted versions of gods he had only heard of in ancient stories, creatures of immense power who had been forgotten by the world. Their forms were monstrous, their eyes glowing with hatred and sorrow. They loomed over Eo, their voices echoing in his mind. We were once worshipped, Eo. We were once powerful. But now, we are nothing. Forgotten. Lost. Eo's heart raced as the gods closed in around him. He wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. Their voices became louder and more insistent, as if they were trying to tear him apart from the inside. You will bring us back, Eo. You will help us reclaim what was taken from us. And in return, we will give you power beyond your wildest dreams. Eo shook his head, his body trembling. No. I won't be your puppet. I won't. But the gods only laughed, a sound that echoed like thunder in the void. You have no choice, Eo. You are already bound to us. You drank the blood. Now, you belong to us. Eo's vision began to spin, and he felt himself falling deeper and deeper into the darkness. The gods' laughter echoed in his ears, and their twisted forms loomed over him, growing larger and more terrifying with every passing moment. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went black. Eo awoke in his apartment, drenched in sweat. His heart pounded in his chest as the memory of the cult, the blood, and the gods flashed through his mind. But as he sat up, something felt different. His hands glowed faintly with the mark the gods had given him, but it was stronger now, more vivid, pulsing with power. Eo could feel it coursing through his veins, filling him with energy he had never known before. He stood up, his legs shaky but steady enough to carry him to the window. Outside, the city was still, the moon casting an eerie glow over the streets. But Eo knew that something had changed. The gods were closer now, their presence more tangible. And with them came a new sense of purpose. But along with that purpose came fear, fear of what he had become, and fear of what he would have to face next. The streets of the city were eerily quiet as Eo moved through the alleys and narrow pathways, the weight of his newfound power making his steps heavier than usual. The glow in his hands faded with each passing moment, but the mark remained, a constant reminder of the god's presence within him. He had heard the stories, gods, forgotten and vengeful, living in the shadows of the world, waiting for the right time to rise again. But now, they weren't just stories. They were his reality. As Eo walked, the air grew thick, almost oppressive. The city, once bustling with life, seemed to have fallen into a strange slumber, as though the gods themselves were watching from the shadows, waiting for something. He had to find answers, and fast. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard the soft footsteps behind him. Eo turned, his heart racing, to find a woman standing in the street, her face obscured by a dark veil. She was tall, her posture regal, with an aura of power that sent a shiver down Eo's spine. You've been chosen, the woman said in a voice that was both soothing and commanding. But the gods are not the only ones watching you. Eo squinted, trying to make sense of her words. Who are you? He demanded, his voice shaky but strong. I am Olwyn, she said, stepping closer. A servant of the gods, yes, but one who understands what they want and what they are capable of. Eo's breath caught in his throat. You know about the blood? The gods. Olwen nodded solemnly. I know far more than you think. I've watched the rise and fall of the gods for centuries. I know their hunger for power, their need to be worshipped. But I also know the price of their return. Eo swallowed hard. What price? She stepped closer, lowering her veil. Her eyes were cold, calculating. You may have thought you were chosen for something great, but there are others. There are those who seek to use the gods for their own gain, to manipulate their power for greed and revenge. And they will stop at nothing. Eo's mind raced. He had thought the gods had chosen him to bring them back, to restore their lost power. But now he wasn't so sure. How do you know all this? I've seen it, she replied simply. The gods' influence is vast. They whisper in the ears of men and women across the world. They twist their desires, lead them to darkness, and in the end, they feed on their fear. But you, she pointed at Eo, her voice growing sharp. You are different. You were chosen by them, yes, but you also have the power to stop them. Eo blinked in confusion. Stop them? How can I stop them when they've already marked me? Olwen smiled grimly. It's not too late. You must find the other chosen ones, those like you, who have felt the gods' power but have resisted it. Together, you can break their hold. But be careful, Eo. The gods are powerful, and they do not take kindly to defiance. Eo's head swam with the enormity of what Olwen was saying. He had thought his path was clear, he was a servant of the gods, the vessel for their power. But now there was doubt. And doubt was dangerous. Where do I find them? Eo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The ones you seek are not far. They are watching you, waiting for the right moment. But you must be careful, there are enemies among them, and some have already fallen under the gods' control. Eo looked at her, uncertainty swelling in his chest. What do you want from me? Olwen smiled, but it was a cold, hollow smile. I want you to succeed, Eo. I want you to remember that power is not always the answer. And that not all who serve the gods are their allies. With that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Eo standing alone in the street, his mind reeling. The weight of the gods' power still pulsed within him, but now, the path ahead was clouded with fear and uncertainty. Who could he trust? And more importantly, who was really in control, the gods, or those who had their own dark plans? Who could Eo trust, and who is really in control? The gods, or those who had their own dark plans? Let's find out. Join us on our next episode.